following the bar exam and how the COVID has been affecting, obviously, large gatherings of people, especially for the bar. I know they have, at least in the one that I sat in, over 1,000 people crammed into one kind of convention center. So how is that essentially going to affect takers of the LSAT?
Yeah, well, it's affected them majorly. They can't possibly cram so many people into a room, of course, as they would for a standard LSAT administration. So they actually moved it online, believe it or not. The
Mm-hmm.
LSAT is now online. They're calling it LSAT-Flex, and the plan is to do it online at home for as long as the COVID situation requires it. So they've done it already. They canceled the April LSAT, made that a new online LSAT-Flex for May. They just
Mm-hmm.
canceled June. They're making that an LSAT-Flex as well. And we'll see what happens going forward.
So I remember when I had sat for the LSAT, we were in a large lecture hall, and is there no way that they're even looking into possibly doing social distancing with? Is that even something that they're talking about?
They've talked about it a little bit, the idea of doing really small administrations, maintaining all social distancing requirements, but for now, at least, they're not actually pursuing that. It's just something they talk about as a potential option. I think given the large numbers of people who actually need to take the LSAT,
Mm-hmm.
implementing social distancing for the exam would just be too difficult for them. Also to find the space to do it in. And given that a lot of places have stay-at-home orders for everything non-essential, you got to be at home unless it's truly essential, and the LSAT is not considered that. They're not even trying to do that unless there's a really special situation for a few people.
So with the LSAT Flex, now, is this across the board for every state in the US now?
It is. It's across the board for every state in the US as well as Canada. So all of North America is LSAT Flex for the May LSAT as well as the June LSAT and potentially the future. Overseas administrations, they haven't figured that out yet. I'm guessing they'll also make those LSAT Flex. Then
Mm-hmm.
there's an LSAT scheduled for the end of June. They haven't made any decision on that yet, but I can't imagine them possibly administering it in person. And given that the internet is available in most places, I could see them easily making the June international test LSAT Flex as well.
So in your opinion, taking a test like the LSAT at home, do you think that that increases chances for cheating, or people, how are they going to monitor, maybe it's not that person taking their exam? Because I know that they're pretty strict on what you can bring into the test, what you can wear. So how are they going to ensure that the test keeps its integrity?
That's a great question. It's one I get a lot. They're using a company called ProctorU, which is the same company that actually does the GRE and GMAT online at home exams, as well as high school advanced placement exams. And so they monitor you with a webcam and a microphone. You hold up your government ID to the camera so they can confirm it's really you. And they have somebody watching you while you take it. And they record all of that for later as well, in case they need to look more closely at anything. They also use what they're calling AI to monitor things like eye movements to see any suspicious activity.
Wow. So they had, so had the software already existed prior to this? Like, because I was going to say they kind of created that pretty fast. That's interesting. When I first heard about it, I didn't think that they would actually have someone that would be there watching. So have they changed the format at all, the length, anything like that?
Yeah, they have actually. It's another limitation of the online experience where an adjustment they have to make. So they reduced the length of the exam from 5 sections to 3 sections. So that's a big change. You're done in 2 hours. And they've
Oh,
also
wow.
removed one of the logical reasoning sections. So that's
Oh,
just a
okay.
requirement of the proctoring company, a requirement of the human body, given that you have to leave the room to go to the bathroom after 2 hours. It's a reasonable request. And you have that on the in-person, but for online, they can't monitor you once you leave the room. So for security reasons, they've shortened the exam. So very different experience.
So you said they removed the writing portion of it, or the writing portion is still in there?
Well, the LSAT writing actually was already online and separated from the regular LSAT last year as
Okay.
part of the general transition towards the digital LSAT. So
Mm-hmm.
that's not going to be on test day either way. But what they have removed is one of the 2 scored logical reasoning sections. So it's only 3 sections, 1 games, 1 reasoning, 1 reading comp, and you're done. So no experimental section, that's unscored, not counting, and no second logical reasoning section. So it changes things quite a bit.
Oh, interesting. So how is that changing the way that you move forward with the way that you coach your students?
Well, one big change is that logical reasoning is slightly less important than it used to be. And LSAC has confirmed that even though logical reasoning was half of the scored exam, and now it's only 1/3 of what's administered, it's also only 1/3 of what counts. So they've weighted all questions equally. So logical reasoning has diminished in importance from about half the exam to about 1/3 of the exam. So when we're prepping and when I'm coaching students, I'm telling them logical reasoning may require a little bit less of your attention, and games in reading comp have increased in importance. That's a content change. Then there's also the test day simulation experience. You're not doing it in a testing center. You're not doing it with other people around you. You're not doing it on a tablet. You're doing it at home by yourself on a computer. So you've got to change how you simulate the test day experience as well. It's got to be on a Windows or Mac computer specifically, desktop or laptop, no tablet, no smartphone, none of that. It's got to be an actual computer. That's what's required in order to run their program, to deal with all the security, basically to make sure all other programs are shut off. So there's nothing that's saving the test content, for example, which would be a security issue. So you got to have the actual device.
This sounds a lot like our law school software that just essentially like we could bring our laptops into the exam and then bring it up, and then it would essentially lock out everything else. But sometimes you would get glitches on it and people's tests would shut down in the middle of the exam, and mine actually happened to me once.
That's terrible. Wow.
Yeah. So does this mean that everyone still takes the LSAT-Flex on the same date and time, or is it kind of go as you can schedule it?
That's actually one of the really cool things about it. I'm glad you brought that up. It's that you're not taking it at a predefined set time that everyone else is doing simultaneously. And if you're an evening person, you don't have to do it in the morning. Like some LSATs used to be in the morning, some were in the early afternoon, but it depended on the month you were taking it in. Now you've got a lot more flexibility where you could schedule it in advance for any time between 9 a.m. and 7 p.m. Eastern time. So if you're a morning person, you could choose that. If you're an evening or afternoon person, you can choose that. And they have those availabilities in 20-minute increments. So you have a lot of options regarding when you take it. And that also helps them on their end with the proctoring, because to have over 10,000 people take it simultaneously, they don't have that many proctors to monitor everybody. But if they can do cohorts in 20-minute increments, that gives them a way to spread things out more for both the proctoring as well as the load on their servers, because there's a lot of people accessing it simultaneously.
So does this mean that people are getting their scores back quicker?
Not as quick as you might think. There's always been this hope with both the digital LSAT and now the online LSAT-Flex that it would be instantaneous, which would be awesome to get your results immediately. Obviously, many other exams offer that. The LSAT does not, unfortunately, but they are getting them back slightly faster than they used to. It used to be you'd wait about 3 weeks. Now they're getting them back in 2 weeks. And I think part of that is because law schools at this point in the cycle, speaking now in the beginning of May, they want those results now so they can evaluate candidates and make decisions on the cycle finishing up now. So they've always been able to do it in 2 weeks, but they like to take their time. But I'm hoping with time it'll be even faster. I'm hoping they would at least give people a raw score immediately or an approximate estimated score immediately, just that you have a rough idea of where you stand.
So does that mean that the LSAT has a curve to it in the way that it's graded?
It's always had a raw score conversion, which we could call the curve, but it's not curved like a law school exam is, where you're tested against everyone else in your cohort specifically. So you would have a reason to like sabotage your next door neighbor, right? Like it's not like that. It's your score is equated to everyone else who's taken it within a certain range of time of a couple of years. So it's not based on that one administration, and tests are even pre-equated, meaning they've measured the difficulty before they even give it to you based on how students did on the experimental sections previously. So they rate the questions on a difficulty scale. And so you're not tested only against those you're taking it within that moment.
Okay.
But I should mention, by the way, that scores on the LSAT-Flex are on the same standard scale of 120 to 180, just like the regular 5-section exam is in person.
Right. So, in your opinion, do you think that those with obviously those with test anxiety, going into a large room with a bunch of people you don't know, going through the process and everything, that obviously affects your mood when you take the test? Do you think that, taking it this way is going to help those that might have test anxiety?
Absolutely. It's a much more pleasant test day experience to do it in your comfortable, familiar home environment. So, assuming that you've got that, assuming you don't have a busy house with kids and pets and roommates all making noise, at home
Mhm.
is probably preferable. Assuming also you have a good internet connection. So, if you can
Mhm.
remove a lot of those stresses associated with the big buildup of finding the right room on the campus where you're taking it, if you're taking it on a campus, or commuting there, or getting stuck in traffic, or your car breaking down, most of that is all of it really is removed. You just got to make
Mhm.
sure your home environment is good. So I think for most people, it's preferable. And if your home environment is not good for some reason, like noise or something else, that or internet connection, you can reach out to LSAC and they will
Mhm.
help you out by providing you with a loaner device if you don't have a good laptop for this, or even connecting you with a local university or law school where you might be able to take it under social distancing conditions.
That's very impressive that they were able to make these changes under um, such short notice. So, how do you think, since there is no standard date that they're taking the exam on, how do you think that that's going to affect law school admissions?
It's already been affected quite a bit in the fact that the tests are more spread out since they're offering it more frequently than they used to. Rather than only being 4 times a year, they increased it to more than 9 times a year. So
Hmm.
tests are spread out. The cycle in general, I think, is getting longer. So
Hmm.
schools are extending deadlines more and more, especially this year since the March and April LSATs were both canceled. So
Hmm.
I think it's just making law schools are waitlisting applicants and they're waiting longer and longer to see who else comes along. They're holding out for those scores. So that's
Hmm.
one major way it's been impacted. And as for LSAT-Flex specifically, I should mention that not everyone's taking it at the exact same time, but there is still a certain cohort where, for the May LSAT-Flex, for example, most test takers are taking it on May 18th and May 19th specifically, and then all of them will get their scores on the same exact date, which is at the moment targeted to be Friday, June 5th. So
Hmm.
they will still get their scores back at exactly the same time. And then law schools, of course, will be able to evaluate them at that time as well.
I had actually read somewhere that some schools, I believe it was Willamette University in particular, was willing to accept GRE scores in lieu of the LSAT scores. Have you heard more about that?
Yeah, a lot of law schools have actually started taking GRE scores. And
So
that's
this is
just,
prior to COVID, or
yeah, even prior to COVID, even over the past year or two, made a big splash in the news when Harvard announced they would take GRE scores
Mhm.
in addition to LSAT scores. And they're just looking to widen their applicant pool.
So what's your opinion on that? Do you think that either test would do, or do you think obviously that the LSAT is more geared towards law school admissions as it should be? Yeah.
The LSAT is more geared towards law school admissions specifically, and it's a good way to signal to law schools that you're really serious about this and
Hmm.
not doing it on a whim. I
Hmm.
also think that there's not really anybody who's going to get in with a GRE score who wasn't going to get in with an LSAT score. You have to be a pretty impressive candidate to get
Hmm.
in with a GRE score. The GRE doesn't have the proper demonstrated correlation with first year law school grades that LSAT scores do, but
Hmm.
the ABA hasn't really taken any action on this because law schools need to widen that applicant pool given the recent declines in the number of applicants to law school.
Hmm.
And we'll see what happens down the line if GRE applicants, once they get in, how do they do in law school itself? How do they do on the bar? We haven't fully seen the consequences of that because it'll take a couple of years, especially in the bar passage side of things. If GRE applicants consistently fail the bar relative to LSAT applicants, that would
Hmm.
indicate maybe the GRE shouldn't be used. So it's
Hmm.
still somewhat of an open question, but I do see the general trend being of more flexibility in general to help keep the pipeline flowing.
So what exactly is the difference between the LSAT and the GRE? So what they're looking at, so to speak, like in testing on and.
It's completely separate content, really. I mean, the
Mhm.
LSAT tests logical reasoning ability, critical reasoning, deductive reasoning. The
Mhm.
GRE is kind of like another SAT. It's got
Okay.
vocabulary, it's got math, but it's a general purpose exam that doesn't really relate very closely to law school,
Mhm.
not nearly as closely as the LSAT does. But in general, for many who would do well on one exam would probably do well on the other as well. But
Mhm.
when you get closer into the specifics, that's where you'll see some differences, especially given that it's much harder to get a top LSAT score than it is to get a top GRE score because of the entire testing pool that you're competing against.
So there is a consistency across the board. So with all this going on and everyone being quarantined in their homes, where before you used to be able to leave and go study, how what would you suggest for people to do to kind of offset this quarantine? Because obviously it's adding a lot more stress than, what already is existing in the moment.
Make the most of the time. I mean, try not to track the news too obsessively. The updates are less frequent these days since we're already now over a month into this pandemic situation. So I would try to stay away from the news as much as possible, other than essential updates, and make the most of this time. If you have more free time on your hands than you previously did, and you're not commuting anywhere, maybe you're saving some time that you could devote to really focusing on the LSAT and studying it specifically. So budget your time, block it out in your calendar. I even put together a specific coronavirus full-time LSAT study plan for folks to help them budget their time over the course of the day. So taking personal time for well-being in general, but also budgeting out blocks of time for nothing but LSAT studying specifically, because it's not going to happen unless you make it happen. And you certainly have competitors to law school who have that free time and they're making the most of it. So you should do the same.
Is there such a thing as overstudying, do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah. You could definitely burn out if you overdo it. So I would take frequent breaks and set barriers and limitations on just how much you do, because it is easy to overdo it. I had someone ask me the other day, should they do 8 hours a day for 60 days? And my answer was no, that's way too much. It's a recipe for burnout. So even 5 or 6 hours a day could be more than enough.
How long would you say as you should be studying prior to taking the LSAT? Because actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll let you answer that question. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. I'd say most people want to spend 2 to 3 months, but it really takes 5 to 6 months to reach your fullest potential on the LSAT. This test requires a lot more of us than we initially expect. Certainly was the case for me. And it was over a long period of time to work through the old exams and really learn to spot the patterns that helped me to reach the breakthroughs necessary to get a top score. So if you're not getting it after a month or two, don't just say, I want to be done with this already. Take the time.
So since they do kind of have like the rolling like exam, so once you're registered for one, you have to take that one, correct? You can't change it? Or like if you come up upon the exam and you're like, I don't feel ready, can you just move it to the next available one?
Yeah, you can actually. It's nice. They give you some flexibility there. So if you make that decision a few weeks prior, you can postpone your test to a later date and they'll only keep some of your money. They'll charge you a test date change fee. But if you decide the day before, you know what, I really thought I'd be ready, but I'm just not where I want to be. Or if something suddenly happened the day before or the week before, that means you just can't do it for whatever reason, then you can withdraw. And law schools will never even know that you were registered for that test. So that should at least remove some of the stress associated with making that decision. And postponing and withdrawing is extremely common. I talk to students all the time who thought they'd be ready, but test day got closer and either something came up or their scores weren't where they wanted them to be. And you push it back. That's totally fine.
Is that how it's always been though? Just change your date and then you pay a fee, or is that a new thing with the Flex?
For as long as I can remember, it's always been that way.
It has been. Okay. So what would you say for everyone to keep their motivation going throughout this whole thing and study habits and everything?
Yeah, no, it's hard when you don't really know how long the pandemic is going to last or all the uncertainty around will you do it as LSAT-Flex online or digital LSAT in person. So one thing I would just say is that the content of the exam has not changed at all. All your previous studying is still perfectly relevant. And whether you're doing Flex or digital or paper and pencil overseas, the content is still going to be the same. So everything you're putting in now will still ultimately help you in the end. And then as test day gets closer, if you got to push it back, totally fine. One nice thing that LSAC has done recently is they've added more test dates. So there's always another test just around the corner, a month or two from now. So you don't have to wait 3 months or 4 months to retake it like you would have in the past. And also, law schools don't average multiple scores. So if you had a lower score previously, or you think you might get a low score coming up, or you're not sure, don't worry. You can always retake it. Law schools will only consider your highest score. So there's incentive to retake, and a previous lower score is not a big deal.
So when you say that they only consider it, does that mean that they only have access to your highest score, or can they see your other scores? Like maybe you've consistently done better each time you've tried.
They can see the others. They can see all scores from the previous 5 years, but they only calculate with the highest score.
Right.
When they're figuring out your LSAT and GPA, how all that mixes together for them specifically, and what they compile it in what they call an admissions index to give them, that's unique to each law school, where they evaluate applicants to see where they stack up and will they help the school raise their own medians that are reported to the ABA, reported to the US News rankings. And a lot of this is numbers driven. And so a higher LSAT score actually does a lot for you to improve your odds of getting into a given law school, because you'll help them raise themselves in the rankings and increase their reputation. So getting a higher score makes all the difference.
Is there an end date that they've given to this flex? Are they saying we're definitely going to this date, like for people who are maybe just started law school started their undergrad this year, that they're looking into it? Is this something that you think is going to keep going even past COVID? Or like, because it seems like they've got it all figured out, why would they want to go back to the other way?
That's a great question. And personally, I see the LSAT-Flex being the new normal for the long term. I don't see a whole lot of reasons why they should go back to in-person, given all the logistical advantages of administering it online. There are a few unresolved issues, like with no experimental section, how would they test out future questions? Or reusing old test forms that are undisclosed, too much potentially. And also, there's the other question of, is a 3-section exam truly comparable to a 5-section exam? And LSAC is saying yes. Law schools are saying yes. There probably isn't a huge significant difference, but there obviously is some difference. And I think it's their preference to do the 5-section in person if they could. But the more they do the 3-section flex, the better they'll get at administering it and dealing with the logistical issues or tech issues. And I see them over time adjusting to this and figuring out the other things. But as for what they're actually saying right now, they're deciding very much on a case-by-case basis, month-by-month basis. They just announced the June LSAT being canceled this past week on Wednesday, and they're holding off on deciding for June International or July or beyond. So we'll see what happens. But I think that over time, if the pandemic does last longer, and I see that happening at least for the summer, then I suspect July LSAT may well be a flex, and same for August.
Oh, wow. Well, I appreciate you answering all my questions that I've had for this. It's definitely been very interesting. I had no idea that all this was going on behind the scenes. It's very interesting.
Well, thanks for having me on, Mia. It's great to connect with you and share this with everyone out there. And I'll just encourage folks to feel free to reach out to me if they need anything at all or have any questions. I'm putting out tons of resources on a daily basis as we learn more around the LSAT-Flex. So folks can find me, Steve Schwartz, over at the LSAT blog, as well as the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast, Facebook group, Instagram. I'm pretty much everywhere putting out information on a daily basis. And so folks can feel free to stay tuned. And yeah, for those watching on my end, do you want to share a little bit about your channel and what you're up to?
So what I've been doing throughout this whole quarantine experience, I've kind of been doing it for myself and also for my subscribers, kind of just filming what I've been doing on a day-to-day basis, aside from work, obviously, because what I do is very confidential. But when it comes to still exercising, and I feel like since we are by ourselves right now, that I found personally that even watching YouTube videos of people like being motivated, having an organized schedule, it makes you feel better. And so my channel has kind of taken a turn towards that, is where before it was mainly law school vlogs and what I would do during that time, my study habits and things like that. So it's definitely shifted throughout. And I also did document my bar prep process, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So
awesome. Well, I'll definitely encourage folks to check that out, both for the bar prep side of things and then just maintaining some sense of normalcy amidst all this uncertainty.
Oh, definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mia. Take care.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.